So good morning, Excellencies, Honourable Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues joining us today here in this conference room, but also by remote connection. Greetings from Sondo and a warm welcome to this session 2.1, which is going to focus on the key role of integrated resilience planning for sectors including transportation, telecommunications, water and energy. My name is Kevin Horsper. I'm the lead climate scientist at the Green Planet Fund, and it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists today who will shortly be sharing some thoughts with you. Firstly, I'm going from left to right as you're looking. His Excellency Mr. Matthew Samuda, the Minister for Economic Growth and Job Creation from Jamaica. And secondly, Her Excellency Mrs. Diane Black Lane, who is Director of the Department of Environment, Ministry of Health and Development in Antigua and Barbuda. And then on the far right is Mrs. Lillian Macharia, who is the Director at the Division of Portfolio Management from the Green Climate Fund. As we know from the most recent Working Group 2 contribution to the IPCC 6th Assessment Report, we're facing multiple climate hazards, even if global warming can be held to 1.5 degrees. And in many human systems and natural systems, our adaptation limits have been reached, and adaptation is becoming more challenging as global warming continues. We have a very narrow window to act. Each year, we see multiple examples of where climate-related hazards and extreme weather threaten people and infrastructure. And the summer floods in Pakistan is just one of the most recent examples, affecting over 33 million people, damaging over 1 million homes, 6,000 kilometres of roads, 269 bridges, and over 17,000 schools. A recent World Bank report examined the cost of infrastructure disruptions to low and middle income countries and the economic benefits of investing in resilient infrastructure. The report had three main conclusions. Firstly, the lack of resilient infrastructure is harming people and businesses. Besides the direct damage of around 18 billion US dollars a year, disruption to services in low to middle income countries amounts to between 400 and 650 billion US dollars on households and businesses. And this places a strain on national budgets, and it reduces the attractiveness of those sectors for private investment. Secondly, though, investing in resilient infrastructure is profitable. Investment in climate resilient infrastructure represents only 3% of overall investment needs. And then, thanks to fewer disruptions and reduced economic impact, the net benefit of investing in developing countries would be $4 for each dollar invested. Climate resilient infrastructure is a $4 trillion US dollar opportunity. And finally, the report concluded that good infrastructure management is achievable through strong institutional mandates and strategies, improved decision-making through data, tools and skills, and crucially, access to financing, especially for risk-informed planning, asset design, and preparedness. The latest IPCC findings state with high confidence that integrating climate change impact and risk into the design and planning of urban and rural settlements and infrastructure is critical and can enhance well-being. Climate resilient development will require action across all system transitions based on integrated solutions that address social inequalities and cut across systems. And the GCF is proud to be supporting countries in bridging the growing investment gap for building new and resilient infrastructure, including the use of green infrastructure to address climate hazards. I will shortly invite our panelists to make their contributions as they prefer, either here at the podium or sat down. But can I kindly invite all of the participants who are watching, please to submit their comments and their questions through the Hover app during the session, and we will then come back to those questions after the presentations. Thank you very much. So without further ado, I will invite our first speaker, His Excellency Matthew Samuda from Jamaica, to provide his intervention.
Good morning, Excellencies. Allow me to acknowledge our Master of Ceremonies and indeed colleague presenters. This morning, I will share with you some of the experiences that we have had in Jamaica as it relates to climate change. Perhaps we'll just signal as each time as we need a slide change. The reality is all of the IPCC reports, all of our lived experiences tell us that the climate has indeed changed. Our weather patterns have changed, and we're already feeling the effects, not just with mass climatic events such as we're seeing in Pakistan, but certainly with slow onset events that are affecting farmers, fisher folk, and the most vulnerable among us. Slide change, please. Sorry, the State of the Jamaican Climate Report in 2019 observed the following changes. We've seen temperatures increasing. In fact, nighttime temperatures increasing at a faster rate than daytime temperatures. Rainfall year to year has varied significantly. Just this year, for context, within May, the month of May, we would have had a rainfall that equal to 11% of our 30-year average. Not 11% below, but 11% of our 30-year average. The very next month, we went 40% above our 30-year average. And we're seeing that not just at the monthly measures, but we're seeing that varied, almost reckless rainfall every month. We've seen an increase in extreme rainfall events. We've seen sea levels rising. We're experiencing it, I believe, at a level of about 1 millimeter a year. And storms and hurricanes have increased in frequency and certainly intensity. The entire South Coast, which does have the majority of the population of Jamaica, is particularly susceptible. The cost of extreme events to Jamaica has been significant. And for all developing nations, each point of GDP represents a very direct correlation with poverty rates with our development targets. Between 1999 and 2021, using loss and damage assessments rather, droughts, hurricanes, floods and rains, tropical storms would have cost us some 28 billion, which translates to about US 187 million. This represents 1.3% of GDP. Now, what is frightening, next slide please, is that assessments coming out of the risks with the changing weather patterns suggests that we could lose up to 10% in a similar period with the current changes between now and 2040 on an annual basis to climatic events. So we've been doing some things that we believe are best practice, and we are supported by the multilateral community in achieving this. We have a range of vulnerability assessments, some that I will speak to in a second, that we're conducting, which speaks to our infrastructure, the risks to the most vulnerable in society, speaks to risks to farmers, and indeed things like water supply. We've been doing regenerative work on our reefs and our dunes to break wave action. These have been affected both by ocean acidification and rising sea levels, as well as by human inaction on matters such as sewage. We've been replanting mangroves at a rate that we believe is particularly important to protect our South Coast. These would have been impacted by not just climatic events, but certainly human action over the last 30 years. We've also been investing heavily in our fish sanctuaries and increasing our MPAs. One of the main things that we've also undertaken to make sure that our microclimate is protected is a national tree planting initiative. In 2019, our Prime Minister would have announced that we would target 1 tree per Jamaica. So 3 million trees in 3 years. We are at 1.5 million trees planted now with a 92% survival rate. We even have an app that tracks the placement of trees to ensure that we're putting in place the nature-based solutions that we need. We've increased our not just marine protected areas, but the protection of our terrestrial mass. We're now at 25%. And though we have committed to the 30 by 30 initiative, we expect to hit 30% of our land mass being protected by 2025. We've also put in place infrastructure. Revetments protect lives. 70% of Jamaicans live within 5 kilometers of the coast. putting our population at particular risk from sea level rise and from climatic events. The agencies in Jamaica charged with this work are our National Environment and Planning Agency, our Forestry Department, and indeed the Fisheries Division. Yesterday, I would have introduced this tool. Next slide, please. It's dubbed JSRAT. It is the Jamaica Systemic Risk Assessment Tool. This tool was launched in May 2022. It represents a partnership between the government of Jamaica, the Coalition for Climate Resilient Infrastructure, Oxford University, and indeed the funding from the GCF. It integrates climate risk analytics into decision-making and planning for key infrastructure. Now, in essence, this tells you all of your risks. It tells you which infrastructure is most at risk, so you're able to plan and invest accordingly. It also future-proofs the investments that you make. So in many ways, for investors, private sector, and indeed public sector, it de-risks the investments because you're very clear on what the risks are, so you know what level of infrastructure has to go where. It's very important for decision-making. Now, this decision-making allows us to plan in a particular way. We have pipeline projects that fit into the big broad categories that we all need to work on if we're to be climate ready. We have projects that fit into sustainable water management, groundwater recharge, water and clean energy supply storage program. And we're also developing a harbor walk, which will also engage significant revetment work in the Kingston and St. Andrew area, which is where 1/3 of Jamaica's population lives, which is virtually at sea level. We're developing a resilience park, and indeed, we have put in place a climate change project development office. Next slide, please. Now, what this shows you is the 7th largest harbor, natural harbor in the world. This is the Kingston Harbor. Now, right around the line that you're seeing is where just over 1 million Jamaicans live. This area is largely considered plains. It is low-lying and is at particular risk from climatic events. It is intended to put in place what we would have classified a Kingston Harborwalk. Now, this is a coastal revetment project which will raise our road and put in seawalls for 28 kilometers, which will put in, raise the walking level and raise the roads, but it will protect significantly the communities which are right along that space. Now, in many ways, the communities that are right closest to our coast are the most vulnerable. So this is where we have some of the weakest housing stock. This is where we have some of the oldest infrastructure by way of water distribution networks and indeed energy. Not typically how people manage their coast, but many developing countries have this issue. This coastal project, and at global standards, per kilometer is $10 million US. So for a country at our size, 280 million US for this sort of revetment work, which only protects 1/3 of your population, is particularly concerning, and it speaks to the challenges that we have with infrastructure. Next slide, please. Now, even with hard infrastructure, you want to ensure that it becomes useful and that citizens see the utility. With putting in this infrastructure, we'll be including pedestrian cycles and dining activities, coastal parks, and indeed shoreline protections, which are very important. But we also are going to ensure that along this coast area, that the nature-based solution enhances the protection. So we've gone about restoring 100 years of mangrove loss, which we believe is particularly important to ensuring that this infrastructure serves the citizens that it protects. The reality is, colleagues, is the challenges we face are here. They're not to come. And if we're not able to mobilize the finance that we need to put in these integrated solutions that serve our citizens, we'll be facing disasters at a faster rate than we have contemplated. I thank you.
I'd like to invite our second speaker, please, to, if she would like to, use the podium or alternatively present from wherever you like. Our second speaker from Antigua and Barbuda, this is Diane Black-Lane, who is the Director of the Department of Environment, Ministry of Health and Development.
Thank you. and thank you for the introduction. So it's good to see everybody and finally travel to Sangdo after a long time. My name is Dan Blackley, and I'm the Director of the Department of the Environment and Ambassador for Climate Change for Antigua and Barbuda. My department is an accredited entity to the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund. And we have 2 projects on the implementation, 2 full funding proposals, as well as 2 readiness. We've provided readiness support to Dominica, and we're implementing one of our projects, the EDA pilot from the Green Climate Fund in Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, and in Grenada. So integrated resilience planning for Antigua and Barbuda, that is our bread and butter. We're a small country, much smaller than Jamaica from the previous presenter. And we wanted to design all of our projects to reflect this. This is not always easy when you're applying for international funding, but we're really like to congratulate the GCF to see that integrated resilient planning, especially for cities, is important. Next slide, please. So just to give you some quick overview, you can see from here. So we are a very small island, as I mentioned. We used to get, so our baseline before climate change, we used to get maybe a hurricane once in every 15 to 20 years. So hurricanes are not unusual. We have a strong building code in place for category 3 hurricane. That's the average largest hurricane we can have. Banks would only lend you to build a house, and you must have insurance. So over 60% of us used to have insurance for hurricanes and drought. And so that is a banking requirement. We expect a drought every maybe 10 years. And at that time, we had Antigua and Barbuda had up to about 60% of our water produced by desalination. And so our baseline rate, if this was 20 or 30 years ago, I would not be here at a meeting for the Green Climate Fund. Politicians don't prioritize adaptation. They wouldn't prioritize mitigation because everything would be fine. So certainly we wouldn't push for an accreditation to have an accredited entity, because for those direct entities who are here, that is a lot of work. And so our politicians would prefer an island like mine with a small amount of people that we're focusing on the work at hand at home. So what do we have now is the cost of doing business and living in the country is being impacted, where about 10% of middle to low income families spending on climate change impacts. And migration, which was something that was halted some years ago from our smaller and developing state, is now on the rise. Hurricanes are occurring 1 in every 5 years. So that's a 3 times in full increase, with the country experiencing its first category 5 in the region in 2017. Insurance rates have increased by over 300% since the baseline year I told you about, with only about 15% of homes can afford insurance. Droughts every 3 years and lasting for more than 12 months. We have loss of over 50% of livestock in the country, which is mainly a subsistence farming, but is an important part of protein for our local population. Farmers need to purchase 100% of their water from desalination, and the country now is aiming towards 100% desalination water. So we presently need about 30 to 60 million US dollars per year to make infrastructure and to build resilient. And this is why we're here. So that is where we leave from a baseline to where we are now. So where we are now, when we looked at climate finance and we study how climate finance is provided to smaller and developing states, the Standing Committee on Finance have shown that the cost of doing business in smaller and developing states is naturally high. So we need to do 1 mile of work in a developed country, or not a typical developing country, will cost about twice as much in the smaller and developing states. So this is related to our market size, perceived risk of financing, as well as the last mile effect. Cost of capital in developed countries is about 3 to 4% interest rate. In islands, it is over 8%. Even when the financial sector is well regulated and with less risk, we are perceived to be high risk. So it costs twice as much plus to do anything in our country, and the cost of capital is at least twice as much. So a family in Antigua and Barbuda have to pay significant per capita more for a bag of cement than the same family in the US, for example. We use the US because they're like 4 hours away from us. So according to IRENA, the cost of renewables are higher in islands than in larger countries. This cost structure and the cost of capital, access to capital, will make sure that the cost incidents are much higher. And that is bad. But what it means is that the pace at which we can reach the minimum level of resilience means that it will be less. So whenever a small island development states speak about, sure, the minister will speak about this as well, as debt, the debt that small island states incurring is that we have to borrow twice as much just to get the same amount of resilience impact in our countries. So for small and developing states like ours, it's a race every single year for every single hurricane season. I have to tell you that I personally still feel anxious, and I check the weather in the Caribbean while I'm here. And I'm told I'm traveling back on this weekend and a storm is in the region. So that's very stressful, but every year we are checking for hurricanes. When I was a child, that was not the case. The cost of material is escalating, insurance is escalating, and the impact of climate finance is reducing, which means not the absolute amount may not be reducing, the absolute amount of climate finance is increasing, but the impact of that financing to us as smaller and developing state is reducing. So what is our strategy going forward? So for Antigua and Barbuda, our idea is we know that the GCF cannot provide us with all the funds that we need. And so we are looking at an integrated approach and a strategy that we can use to make whatever little funds that we have a greater impact. And that is the fundamental basis of our way going forward. Climate finance actions is being channeled to the people. So we believe that government should be able to access as much money for infrastructure from other sources, but the funding that we're raising would go to the people to get their homes, farms, and businesses ready using a technology-focused approach. So for this, the GCF, we have received a project, the Enhanced Direct Access Project, funding proposal 061, and that is one of our first projects we applied for to be able to accomplish this. We're using GCF funds to provide low-cost capital to people, which is funding proposal 061. We lend them at a low-cost rate so that they can get their homes ready. Government is also implementing resilience building and infrastructure by the GCF bill funding proposal 133. We look at key critical buildings that after hurricane or during a drought, those buildings need to be operational. The policy shifts that we're looking to implement once these projects get going and we have a momentum building for resilience is that the government may mandate that everybody has to purchase catastrophic insurance for their homes, which means that you can prepare your home for category 3, but above that is very difficult. So we're looking to mandate all homeowners to have insurance for Cat 4 and above. We have to also look at the diversification of our energy systems, because when there's a hurricane or drought, you need backup energy system in our country. And in many countries, there is a monopoly fossil fuel industry to provide energy. And we're looking to see that we can change this to provide diversity and to provide consumer choice in how they purchase their energy systems. This is what we feel will limit the impact of a sudden high spike of energy costs, as well as when you introduce competition, even in a small island like ours, you can have price reduction. So all hands on deck approach, which means that at the community level, we are providing grants from these same projects to churches, sports, and the sporting complexes to encourage young people to participate, and in schools, healthcare systems in Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, and Grenada. So next slide, please. So we said before that the GCF cannot provide all the funds that we need. And so we have to be extremely strategic in how we approach. So we are suggesting in the next programming cycle that the GCF could consider the following: provide funding for significant community actions for churches and schools as to perform duty as shelters for hurricanes, droughts, and now we have a new phenomenon of heat. Key infrastructure, and this is for small and developing states, it may not be applicable to all countries. Key infrastructure protected and available during extreme weather events, which is what Jamaica is presenting for their harbor. Access to low-cost capital so homeowners can build resilience, and then finally afford insurance, leveraging the private sector, the private finance sector at the micro level. So right now, if your home is a category 1, your category 1 certified, your insurance rate will be astronomical. So if we get financing to help them, then they can afford cheaper insurance. Assist with programs and projects that can lead to states debt forgiveness linked to crowding in the private sector for low-cost insurance and financing for community action. And finally, we think that the Green Climate Fund can leverage additional partnerships with entities like FIFA and the Olympics to assist in their national committees to integrate climate change into sporting infrastructure. This alone over 4 years is hundreds of billions of dollars, because many of these organizations provide financing at the national level to build sporting infrastructure. And why sporting infrastructure? Right after a hurricane and a country have to rebuild, it's really important to get back to normal. And we want our schools to be open. We want our sporting facilities to be open. And this is important for our mental health as we're moving forward into a world where the weather is constantly changing. So, so this is some of the recommendation we have for programming to the Green Climate Fund. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. And our final speaker, last but very much not least, Lillian Machara, who's the director of our Division of Portfolio Management. Thank you, Lillian.
Thank you and good morning. After those two powerful speakers, it's a hard act to follow, but I'll try. So I want to take this opportunity to speak to what GCF is doing. I think from the various speakers, we have pretty much gotten a sense of the real impact of climate on some of the vulnerable countries like small and island development states, especially with regard to infrastructure. So we'll look at, I'll just share with you a little bit about some of what the work we're currently doing on resilience planning. And if you go to the next slide, I'll just start by repeating what has already been indicated. First, we know that adaptation needs are highest amongst developing countries. And these are also countries that are already suffering from inadequate infrastructure and also don't have the means to address the impact, and the damage caused by those extreme events. As you can see in this panel, we have data or photographs from a study that was carried out in 138 countries, which shows that, most of the low-income countries are affected inordinately by, electricity disruptions and water disruptions. And you can imagine what that means in terms of productivity, economic losses, as well as indicated by just the previous speaker, Diane, on cost of business. And then this then also does also affect other things. You can imagine if you're in a hospital when there's power outage and is a country that's also struggling with water. So just looking at the not just economic, but also the human toll is a bit concerning. So if we move on to the second slide, we also note that from a study of, an analysis of nationally determined contributions and adaptation plans of 26 non-1 countries, infrastructure ranks second after agriculture in terms of where these countries feel they need the most support to address climate impacts. And we note that already, even within the 100 billion that's been pledged for climate finance, the funding flows to adaptation are still very limited and they lack the demands that exist. So if we move on to the next slide, one will also then see then that this is actually counterintuitive given the fact that if you look at the investment case for adaptation, it's very strong. If you look at, and for resilience, funds invested in resilience will generate benefits between twice and up to 10 times of what the cost is. And you're looking at benefits in terms of the avoiding economic and human life losses. I don't know if you can actually even quantify what the value of a human life is, but if you look at what the benefits of just really strengthening resilience, I think they are significant, but yet we don't see as much in terms of flows towards that. And the question then is, why are we not seeing those kind of flows? So if we go to the next slide, what you then notice that one, we need to address a number of barriers, whether they are perceived or actual. One is, if you look at the political and regulatory barriers, that is things related to taxation, regulatory environment that, it's easy to enforce contracts for investors. So those are some of the barriers that reduce flows, especially when you're looking at potentially private sector investments. The second one is, of course, macroeconomic issues and budgetary barriers related to things such as inflation, interest rates, as well as, forex fluctuations. I think everybody right now is acutely aware of all of these factors because we are in a significantly high inflation environment. Forex, there has been significant forex fluctuations, and these have significant impact on liquidity, and predictability and comfort for investors. And the final one is, of course, we have to address technical barriers related to the use of technology and cost of it, or vis-a-vis also using obsolete technologies that then are not able to withstand the climate events and provide the protection or stability that is required in terms of service provision. So to address this, we would need then, our aim is to, if you go to the next slide, is to try and help change the current perceptions of investments in climate resilience infrastructure, whereby they are currently seen to be more costly and yielding less returns compared to just doing business as usual. It is true, in our view, that it would initially cost a lot more to do a climate resilient infrastructure. But if you look at over the longer term, the benefits are a lot more. And that's what we'd like everybody to move to, because we realize then that if you have a strong infrastructure, then you don't have those disruptions. You can continue getting the services, the economies flow. And if you're looking at getting returns, then you have a base upon which you can actually generate those returns. So this effort is what underscores underlines our efforts and our current pilot, which we're working on in Jamaica, where we are seeking to develop and demonstrate the viability of systemic project origination methodology, which would help develop project concepts that either use green or hard, solutions to strengthen resilience of existing infrastructure. And in this case, we're working very closely with the government of Jamaica. Now, if you go to the next slide, I'll just give you a bit of what we are trying to do. Honorable Smunda has talked about the tool that has been developed by Oxford University under this initiative. And this tool helps map, first and foremost, the infrastructure interventions and damage exposure, looking at where the infrastructure lies, and also looking at the trends in terms of hazards, whether it is drought or flooding or hurricanes, and then also helps calculate the potential or expected economic loss under different scenarios. Then using that, basically we assess, then that tool helps assess the hazards, damage, vis-a-vis the different infrastructure and economic loss risks, and then to also help then map the asset damage risk as well as the risk itself, and then help us identify where we have hotspots, where those are areas where you see climate impact or climate events would cause significant damage to the economy or definitely cost a lot. So for us, if you go to the next slide, what you're then trying to do is then develop a methodology that will help translate that information into project concepts. And then that would ensure that the infrastructure would be resilient to climate hazards. And this looks at both whether using nature-based solutions or hard infrastructure, hard solutions, or sometimes even perhaps looking at relocating infrastructure. And by what we would then do with the methodology helps us do is identify and select hotspots where, based on the mapping that I've said of hazards, and then help prioritize investment or interventions that would be required. Helps identify, should you be doing hard or soft based on how quickly, how frequent, and how resilient, and how appropriate the solutions would be, given the intensity and perhaps the frequency. And then also affordability issues. And then from that, we look at generating project concepts that would help leads to a pipeline of technically viable and financially viable projects, and that will take into account climate risk considerations. For us, here we look at looking at potential de-risking options, which I think was mentioned by Diane, which are critical to ensuring that one, we are able to crowd in additional investments, but also at an affordable cost, because as you realize already the climate resilient infrastructure is perceived to be pretty expensive. I mean, to be very, high risk. So if we de-risk the investments, then we're able to, one, attract more investors, but at the same time, we also need to make sure that it's done in a manner that the cost is affordable, given that the countries we are looking at also are vulnerable, and debt sustainability is a definite issue. So ultimately, what we hope that the project will do is then, as I say, lead to the pipeline of projects and have actually technically viable and operationally viable projects that investors will be happy to work on. So the last slide just shows you the stages that I've highlighted and of how we are doing that work. We start with the mapping, which has been done by the Oxford University. And then we are coming in with the methodology to help look at prioritization and determination of what interventions work, and then looking at how we prepare concept notes that are viable, taking into account technical and other factors, as well as looking at how do you de-risk that. And then ultimately, we also, and this we are doing also in consultation, very close consultation with the government and stakeholders to make sure that it's also appropriate to the local context. And out of that, then we will come up with concepts and projects that can be funded. And this we are working with the CCRI, who has also a network of significant investors who then can come in and make investments in those kind of projects. So ultimately, our hope is that based on this pilot, we'll come up with a methodology that can be replicated and applied to different countries without removing a lot of the guesswork into the process. And that also helps countries take a more strategic and systematic approach to resilience planning, so that you prioritize those infrastructure that are at high risk, that high value, and where you, by just mitigating or making them more resilient, you're able to strengthen the resilience of the country and the economy. And with that, I'll say thank you very much for your attention and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all three of our speakers for some insightful and very relevant talks, all outlining some very different aspects of the approach to building in climate resilience. So perhaps we could just give our three speakers a round of applause, please. I'm not seeing any questions on the Hover feed. I'll just check that. And please, I do encourage people, if you have a question, please use the Hover app and submit it. I'll keep monitoring the questions coming in, and perhaps I'll just use my position as the moderator to ask some questions myself to warm things up. So perhaps I could start by asking Minister Samudi. You showed a range of transformational measures for Jamaica there. Very diverse and all very targeted towards providing resilience in the face of climate change. Finance is clearly a major barrier, but in your experience, apart from finance, what's the other most important barrier to implementing measures such as the ones you showed us?
Well, invariably, you're right, finance is the major issue. But invariably, us politicians in the room will tell you one of the big challenges is bringing the population along. Prioritizing investments and what an Excel sheet tells you is not always what a vulnerable community feels. So building a seawall as opposed to investing in housing stock versus a new water main versus cheaper energy solution is always an interesting conversation. How do you tell someone who is, flirting with the poverty line or fighting for their survival that you're making a 30-year investment when they can't see the next 30 days? And in developing countries such as ours, we have a about 14 to 15% of the population living below the poverty line. We have another 14 to maybe 30% who are at risk of falling to that poverty line. You know, long-term investments and these sorts of climate-ready infrastructure projects are a difficult sell to a population like that. Even though, you know, it's what will protect them, it's what will save them, it doesn't change their quality of life. So politically, those of us who you know, get our report card every 4 to 5 years, it's a difficult sell to make a 40-year investment when you have 4 to 5 years to impress your boss. So that's, I think, the major challenge that we face in developing states, especially at the political level.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think that sort of brings into sharp focus the timescales that people respond to. And I think it also just underlines the importance of keeping the climate conversation live and active to make clear to every generation that action we take now will benefit the subsequent generations. Perhaps I could ask a question of Diane as well. In Antigua and Barbuda, you spoke of falling behind in the race, and I think we can all understand very clearly the reasons why. Is there some adaptive management that you have identified that, in the context of the current project, are there lessons that you've learned from the current project that have helped bring it into a slightly different focus to the original plan? Has the project adapted as it's been implemented?
So thanks for that question. I think it's difficult to have adaptive management with the projects where the cost of like COVID-19, for example, was not budgeted into it. So for our EDA project, which is a response to a GCF RFP, it has no contingency budget. And in general, there's this push to not have contingency budget in most projects anymore. So I think, and there are good reasons for that, so we're not complaining about it. But it's just weird to have a green climate fund that talks about varying weather and all of those things. And then the projects are being designed like a World Bank project with no contingency funding in it for weather impacts, especially in the Caribbean. So I think that is one of the issues. I think I would like to speak to what the minister from Jamaica had said as well. The transitional risk for resilience and the danger of that to politicians, the political risk is high. And because of that, we wanted to do a microfinancing project so people could see an impact of what is happening in their lives immediately while the infrastructure project is going along. And I think I want to emphasize that for smaller and developing states, it's a quick fix that the country could participate. The enhanced direct access modality could be very important to our smaller and developing states compared to a larger country. And it will help for many of the persons that the minister speaks to get an opportunity to see an immediate impact in their life. That's important. And in the community, we've been doing work with the churches so people can see something in the churches. We started to do work with the sporting facilities so young people can see something happening there as well. And that is our way to mitigate the risks as we're implementing and to help with the transitional risk, especially political impacts. And I think that has helped us a lot. But just going back to the idea of in islands where we have hurricanes and droughts, there's no contingency funded but budgeted in the project. And finally, as a direct access entity, the fees that we have is not really that much to be able to deal with issues like COVID-19, or if you get hit by a hurricane, the project is wiped out. And there's no flexibility to change the scope as well. When that happens, you either increase the funding or you change the scope. So even within the way that we implement and roll out projects and manage risks need to be looked at a little bit more for smaller and developing states.
Thanks very much. And I think that just illustrates, how crucial it is that with the change of the intensity and frequency of extreme events, new extreme events are already affecting projects that are attempting to mitigate those extreme events. And yes, it's a fight that we need to invest strongly in if we are to keep up. A question for Lillian, and then there are some questions coming in from the audience now. Lillian, you spoke about the systematic resilience tools that are being developed for the Jamaican project, very sophisticated approach to identifying, the most appropriate investments, the most appropriate solutions in terms of both grey and green infrastructure. In your experience, What type of stakeholder engagement is necessary to make an approach like that happen? Because it requires a lot of stakeholders to get around the table. So perhaps you could share some experiences in what we've had to do in that pilot project in order to move it forward.
Thanks, Kevin. It's a good question. I'm not sure I have the magical answer for that. But maybe I'll just start from where my fellow panelists started from. I mean, I think where they left off. One is that, and obviously I'm not a politician, but I think the reality is that you have to take people from where they're at. And I think the point is, if I'm struggling with the day-to-day lives, then I have to first of all address my immediate needs before I can start thinking about the long term. So our sense is that you definitely have to involve, of course, critically the key stakeholders, which is the government, because the government of the day determines what's going to happen. But also you have to involve the community so that you understand how you get the buy-in, what are the immediate concerns, and how you integrate them in the planning so that it's not just, how would I say, it's not very theoretical. It has to be grounded on, what are the immediate priorities? How does the, what are they grappling with so that they can then address the longer term issues. So I think right now the Jamaica pilot is in early days. I think what we've done is worked very closely with the government, but also we've also had the stakeholders who are like the service providers, the businesses, the utility providers, and others, and other members of the community, so that then they are able to indicate where what the challenges they face from those impacts. And then based on that, then you're able to, because that's part of quantifying the cost, is also having that sense of what does it mean, not just for the business or the economy per se, but also to the human toll of impact. So in our view, you have to have them as part of the journey. True, some things may not be fully understood at all levels, but you have to bring on everybody along the journey, so that eventually the intervention is sustainable and it also has ownership. So our plan is, and that's why we are saying, even in the prioritization of interventions, coming up with solutions, you also look at what are the opportunities that perhaps can address some of the other immediate needs in the solutions you're coming up with. I think that's important as you go along the way, both in terms of identifying the impacts, prioritizing, determining the solutions you're coming up with. And then when you're looking at for potential financing, you also have to then look into the, how reasonable and how effective and how appropriate is that given the country context or the local context. Over.
Thanks very much, Lillian. We have a question from Pablo Davis in the audience. He's asking if any of our panelists have successful experience of where they've managed to catalyze private investment for resilience planning. Would anyone like to take that question? Thank you, Diane.
Yeah, so our EDA project, so for Antigua, it's a small country, we look at private sector as the individual homeowner, from the family investing their own money right up to the community where where the government invests their money. So so for our local family member, they've invested quite a bit. They borrowed the money at 2% interest rate, and now they're paying it back. And then that means more money is there to lend to other persons. We've also seen the private sector getting involved in the sense that where they're seeing a certainty with money's coming ahead, so they can bring in solar panel kits in bulk, and they're looking to invest in that themselves, that there will be a market. And that's another thing, to get the private sector involved, there must be a market. And on the area of insurance, we do have insurance companies that are interested in looking at a different way of providing insurance for homeowners. So in Antigua now, I'm not sure for Jamaica, but you insure the whole home. So there's an important insurance product for just the roof or just for the windows or something like that, which will make it a lot cheaper. So at first, the insurance companies lobbied against that. And now we're seeing a more open idea that they would want to get into the market, of crowding them into a market where they used to have a 50-60% insurance rate, and now it's only 15%. So they're seeing that with climate change, that they're losing market share and opportunity. And I guess the younger insurance executives are seeing an opportunity where you can come in and invest in providing different products in the insurance sector. So we're seeing a really opening of eyes and seeing that that is something that they could do. And they're very interested in the project for the EDA because it means that, and the NAPS project that we're implementing, we also have a NAPS readiness and a multi-year readiness where we can provide much more detailed information about risk. So the information, we're getting closer and closer to assess the actual risk. And with that, they're very much interested in understanding that they can now, in a better understanding of the investment climate that they can get involved with. So I think we're on the verge of seeing a much, in Antigua, the OACS region, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, which regulate banks, have several $100 million on their bank books that they want to lend. And they're looking forward to a diversification of the energy systems so that they can start investing in energy as well, compared to right now they're doing homes and cars and land and stuff like that. So we're seeing a big interest in the private sector, and they're doing, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank is doing a green banking assessment of their green banking portfolio. And so they're looking at, I see one of the videos you were showing earlier about sustainable businesses, smaller microfinancing businesses, which they never really want to get involved with. So we're seeing a big interest coming in there. And so as more as we implement the projects and we have lessons learned and we can get products that they can see, I believe that they will be coming in droves.
Thank you. I think, Minister, you'd like to add to that.
So just to follow up where my colleague left off, there is a lot of what we classify as retail and consumer interest in investment in renewables, certainly at the household level. That appetite is pretty significant. What we've found is that coming out of COVID, some of the supply chain disruptions has slowed that retail deployment of renewables. But at the private sector level, I think the two greatest areas of interest and examples of success thus far is both in energy and in water. So what we found is that there's a lot of interest and investment potential, both in renewable energy, in terms of provision to our grid, and in providing water under water purchase agreements to the National Water Commission in Jamaica. Now, on the renewable energy side, we do have some legal hurdles, and like many other developing nations, we would have issued a monopoly type license to a single provider and distributor. We believe we will overcome those hurdles this year, and we have several projects that have come on stream and some larger ones that we believe will start to decarbonize our energy usage, but also protect us from oil shocks. Apart from climatic events, the only other times Jamaicans have gotten poorer is when you have international oil crises. So that resilience also in decarbonizing, which we absolutely want to do, we absolutely need to do as a moral imperative. It's also an economic imperative to reduce the impact that we face every 10 or so years when whatever global crisis comes along. So examples, we have the largest solar park in the Caribbean. I think that's about 48 megawatts, which is provided by private sector investment, which connects to our grid. In another 2 weeks or so, we will unveil a floating solar system, which will provide 45 megawatts of firm power to our grid. That is all private sector investment. It will also function to reduce evaporation coming out of our largest reservoir, which is particularly important for us where we're having such erratic rainfall. And the very installation of that grid will desilt the reservoir. So that's a major, I think, success of private sector mobilization for a resilience and mitigation project. On the water side, and we find that they're never too far from each other. We have a massive non-revenue water problem, and many other developing nations have it as bad. We have parishes, which are like counties or municipalities in other spaces, which have up to 70% non-revenue water. Now, with climate change being what it is and the risks to water supply being what it is, that is an unmitigated disaster. We've now mobilized private sector to do two things. We've mobilized them to invest in the distribution networks within new development, new housing developments, so that it takes the pressure off of the National Water Commission in terms of building into those new areas. So we're able to focus on legacy issues. And secondly, we've also established several water purchase agreements from those who have large land holdings, where we've been able to establish that they have sustainable water supply in their land, and we're able to plug that into the grid. That has solved a lot of the supply issue. The non-revenue water issue, we expect to make significant strides between now and 2030. So I think those are two great examples of private sector mobilization that have served us well.
Thank you very much for those answers, and thank you for the question. We're reaching the end of the session, and there are no more questions in the list. So I'll close as quickly as possible to give us a quick breather before the next session starts. To reiterate the IPCC, there's a rapidly narrowing window of opportunity for us to enable climate resilience development. And taking integrated action to avoid climate risk requires urgent decision-making now across the built environment, urban design, and infrastructure use. So I think it's been a rich conversation during this session. We've seen from our speakers some ambitious, imaginative, and transformational actions that are relevant to building in climate resilience. I'd like to thank the audience for your participation. I'd like to thank the question. But finally, once again, I'd like to thank our three speakers for their talks. And if we can just show our appreciation, that brings this session to a close. If you could bring up the final slide, please, that just gives everyone a reminder of the next session. That ends session 2.1. Thanks very much.